Good morning, YouTube. This is the 2002 Honda Odyssey back in my garage again today, and I've had a project I've been wanting to do on it all winter long and waiting for a warm day. And yes, indeed, you are looking at the power steering pump. Because one day I noticed this. So here in the driveway, I noticed a bunch of drips, not only here, but other places that we've been parking the van. And, so I went and looked underneath to find out where it was coming from, and it was from under the right front of the van. This is what I saw under the van. Things are nice and damp. This is under the right-hand side. It's kind of blowing back across a lot of the cross members and exhaust. And I've determined the power steering pump is the culprit. It's all damp all around here, especially more toward the back. I can't tell exactly where it's leaking. It could be around the main housing, could be around this fitting, could be the main seal on the shaft, or could be around back. So today's project is we're going to take the power steering pump off and give it an overhaul. To do the job properly, I have my factory service manual here. It has a nice exploded view of the internals of the power steering pump, as well as all the steps involved in doing a pump overhaul, along with proper torque settings and the steps to do it. I also purchased a power steering pump repair kit. Here's your part number, 348527. This is a Gates brand pump repair kit, and it comes with a whole series of O-rings and a main seal. And hopefully that will do the trick. I got this from Rock Auto, and it was with shipping about 20 bucks. And that's a whole lot better than buying a new or remanufactured pump for, upwards of 200 bucks. So we first need to remove the plastic engine cover. These are held on with 10mm bolts. Alright, next I wanted to empty the reservoir with all the fluid in it. So I took the cap off, and then I used my turkey baster, and I removed as much as possible into a can and into a proper receptacle. Then I drained the remaining part of the reservoir by removing this lower hose right here. Slid the clamp off and removed the hose, and then I have a rag under there, and I captured any remaining part that was in there and kind of dumped it out. Now, once the reservoir is empty, you can just lift it off of this bracket. It's a little tough. You can see the metal bracket there. You just lift it straight off the bracket like that. That actually helped to dump that remaining fluid out into a little can or onto that rag. I'm going to remove the high pressure line fitting from the top of the pump first. This is a 10mm bolt. Make sure you have rags at the ready so you don't want to make a big mess in case any fluid leaks out. There's an O-ring in here that seals this connection. Not too messy. There's an O-ring right there. We'll be replacing that later. Probably the last thing we'll be doing. On the lower hose, this is the low pressure side, the return side. Slide the clamp back. Since I've got the return line off of the reservoir, I can take this whole assembly out in case I want to empty this a little bit more or rinse it, clean it out. To remove the tension on the belt, there are 3 fasteners. There's a nut right there. That adjusts the tension on the belt, and there's 2 mounting bolts. One right there, and then there's a nut. It's really hard to see, but you can see the end of my socket right there goes back up under the pump, and is the lower fastener. So we're going to remove those 3, or at least loosen those 3 fasteners to remove the tension on the belt and remove the belt. So I'm just going to loosen these so we can get the pulley off. stuff some rags under here to keep it from dripping on the belts below. It's a little loose, right? So hopefully we can just get the belt off. There we go. I'll just let that lay down there. So now I'm going to jump ahead because the pulley nut that holds the pulley on can be hard to get off. And there are different ways of getting that off. You could use, of course, an air impact wrench. I'm not going to do that because most people don't have those. So I'm going to show you more of a manual technique. The service manual shows this special holding tool. It has 2 pins and it adjusts and goes through 2 of the holes in the pulley so you can hold the pulley and remove the nut. I don't have that special tool. You can make one. Some people have done that, but I'm going to use a different technique. So for this technique, I'm going to take advantage of the pump being attached to the car rather than doing this after removing it. Just going to firm up these connectors, these fasteners, and make sure that it's tightly attached to the engine. So I've got no more play. Then we're going to take 3/8 extension right through one of the holes and just rest it right there. So one end is sitting on top of the pump housing and the other end is resting down here on the top of the motor mount. So that'll keep the pulley from turning. 19mm socket on the nut, and I believe this is normal left-handed threads. We should just be able to pop this loose. There we go. And with the pulley taken care of, we can go ahead and remove the pump altogether and get started with the overhaul. I'm still getting some dripping from the inlet hose, and I've got a rag below there. Make sure you keep this off of your paint, and if you spill any, make sure you wipe it up right away. Now with the pump removed, I can give you a little better view of that bolt down there. That's the lower bolt that the nut goes on. And actually, you can see it goes through the tensioner. That's how tension is applied to the belt. Alright, let's begin the overhaul and start the disassembly process. This is the way it was oriented on the vehicle. Here's where the pulley for the belt was. Of course, we removed the nut already. Normally you take that off and you put it into a vise this way and remove that nut, but I chose to do it while it was still in the car. Next we want to remove the flow control valve, which is this assembly in here. It takes a 10mm hex. It's going to be pretty tight, so I'm going to go put it in the vise to take that out. You see the O-ring right there on the flow control valve cap. We'll be replacing that upon reassembly. And a spring. This the flow control valve itself. Next, we're going to remove the pump cover. The pump cover has 4 bolts, and they're 12mm bolts. So let's take a look at some of these internal components. So now that we've removed the pump cover, see the pump cover has 2 roll pins in it, and they're different sizes. There's a 4.5mm roll pin and a 5mm roll pin, and they help to align all the components and make sure you've got them in the correct orientation. Now what came off with the pump cover is this outer side plate. Now if I remove the outer side plate, comes right off of the roll pins. It looks like that. It's flat on the outside, and it has these indentations on the inside. Now you can get a better look at the pump cover seal set down into that groove. You can also see this passageway that's inside of the pump cover. This passageway feeds to both sides of this side plate. Now if I look a little further, you can see the pump cam ring, which is this outer ring, and inside of the pump cam ring is the pump rotor. That's the center part here. Inside of the pump rotor, you get 10 pump vanes. These little metal strips are pump vanes. And now you can kind of start getting an idea of how this works. As it turns, these vanes will spin out like that against the outside of the pump cam ring and push fluid in that direction and out through one of those passageways. So now I'm going to try and remove the pump cam and hopefully keep all the vanes in place. If not, they'll fall out. Looks like I've lost most, if not all, of my pump vanes. That's alright, we'll just put those back later. There's the pump cam ring. Capture all the vanes. Next is the inner side plate. The inner side plate also has these passages where the fluid goes through and back. On the back side of the inner side plate, there's an O-ring embedded in there. We'll be replacing that one. And there's a large O-ring down inside of the housing, back in there. We'll be replacing that one as well. The sub valve is on top, and it's held in with a small snap ring. You got these really thin-tipped needle nose pliers to get that snap ring out. And that's the sub valve. Now we want to remove the pump drive shaft. And it has a bearing on top, and the bearing is held in with a snap ring or a circlip. You need snap ring pliers to remove that. It's got 2 holes. To remove the pump drive shaft, we actually drive it out. I'm going to drive it and the bearing out. So you use a plastic hammer, plastic headed hammer, so we don't damage the shaft, and just simply drive it out. So what came out was the drive shaft with the bearing still pressed onto the shaft. We're going to leave that in place. Down in the bore was this pump seal spacer, which concealed the main pump seal. To remove the main pump seal, you need to pull it out. It's too firmly pressed into the bore. So one thing you can do is you can use a small screwdriver and just catch the lip of it and either press it by hand and work it out, here it comes, or tap it really lightly with a hammer. But what you want to be careful of is just not to scratch the inside of the bore. So there's their main pump seal. As part of the rebuild, you want to make sure that the flow control valve is in good condition. So the instructions state that you should inspect it for grooves or burrs or uneven wear. Also check the inside of the bore to make sure that there are no score lines, or make sure that that's not worn. And to take the flow control valve and to insert it into the bore and ensure that it can go in and out freely without binding. And this one's fine. If that's bound up or otherwise overly worn or scored or burred, then you should just replace the pump. We want to check the drive shaft bearing, make sure that the bearing is still in good condition. So just rotate the outer race, make sure that there's no play, no excessive play, there's no grinding, there's no roughness, and then it still turns smoothly and freely and quietly. This one's fine. So after inspecting all the parts and making sure nothing was worn excessively, it's time to begin reassembly. Let's do so by installing the sub valve. It's important to get the sub valve in with the proper orientation. A little pin on the right hand side of that sub valve. There's also an oil passage there. If you look in the bore, if I hold it in this orientation, the pin goes in that hole to the right, and the oil passage is on the top. So we'll make sure that that pin falls in that hole. And then we reinstall the clip. Make sure the clip gets all the way down in there and seated in the groove. I'm going to install the new main seal. You see it has a flat surface on one side and a grooved surface on the other. The grooved side goes down into the bore. And I'm going to lightly lubricate it with some new power steering fluid. Just a little goes a long way. Help it slide into the bore. Kind of get it started by hand, get it lined up. And it goes down pretty easily. Just for good measure, I'll use a 24mm socket. Line it up and just tap it gently. it's flush on top. On top of the main pump seal goes the pump seal spacer. It's just like a big washer. And next goes the drive shaft. Now the drive shaft needs to be driven into the bore, but we don't want to ruin the bearing. So we're going to use a 30mm socket on the outer race of the bearing and to use that to drive it down into the bore. So I put the housing on a couple blocks of wood so that the drive shaft can protrude down through. Set it down into the bore with my 30mm socket. And we'll drive it home until it bottoms out. Now we know it's all the way down when we can see the groove where the snap ring goes. The snap ring goes in next, and if you look closely at the snap ring, it has a radiused side and a flat side or a sharp side. So this edge is slightly sharp, whereas this edge is slightly rounded over or radiused. The radiused side faces out. Now to replace the seal in the pump cover, we can remove the old one. I'm going to use a pick tool. Be careful not to scratch the surface. There's the old one. I don't know if you can tell on the video, but that's quite flattened out. It's no longer an O-ring, it's a flattened out ring, and it's somewhat hardened too, so it's good that we're replacing these. This may be the one that was leaking. I can't really tell which seal was leaking, but it's likely it was this one. So taking the new seal from the kit, you can see this one's nice and round. I'm going to use a little bit of new power steering fluid just to lubricate this. As we assemble all these parts, we want to make sure that they seal well and they don't roll up or get kinked during reassembly. We'll just lay it down in there in the groove, just like that. Outer side plate goes next. Remember I had a flat side. Flat side is what goes toward the cover. And it can only go one way because the two roll pins are a different diameter. If you try and put it on the wrong way, it won't go. The pump cam ring goes on next. Make sure it's clean. And it only goes one way. And if you noticed here on this side, there's a very small dot right there. The other side does not have a dot. Right? So this side with that small dot goes down. Again, it'll only go one way because the pins are a different diameter. Next, the pump rotor, and just like the pump cam ring had a dot, so does the pump rotor. You see that dot right there? It's only on one side, no dot on that side. So the dot goes down. Place it right inside the pump cam ring. Now with the pump rotor in place, it's time to install the vanes. So there are 10 vanes. All but one of mine fell out. Now it's important to note that these vanes have a rounded edge and a square edge or flat edge. The rounded edge faces out. And that's what mates with the cam ring. The square edge is toward the the hub or the inner portion of the pump rotor. One other really subtle detail that I've heard people describe that you might want to get correct is on these worn pumps. There's a bit of a wear pattern on that vane. Longitudinally, there's kind of a mark or a wear line. If I flip it over, you don't see that, or it looks different. On this side, that wear line is almost in the middle of the vane. So the orientation of that vane, according to the one vane that didn't fall out, was on the, I guess you'd say, the counterclockwise side of the rotor. So there's the side that has that mark on it with the rounded edge facing out. It's going to go into the rotor this way. Here's the next one. Again with that mark. That little wear pattern. Square edge in, rounded edge out. There's the mark. It's going to go into the rotor this way. Apparently that has something to do with the drive forces, the direction the pump turns, and you don't want to upset those wear marks. You make sure you put it back the way it came. So I'll do the rest of these vanes. All right, this is the inner side plate, and it has an O-ring here, so we'll remove this O-ring carefully with the pick tool. That O-ring does feel a little flattened out this direction and fairly hard. Here's the new one from my kit. It seems to match in size. I always compare and make sure they're the same. Try to coat it with some new power steering fluid and set it down inside of the plate, the inner side plate. Then we'll install the inner side plate on the pins, and again it should only go one direction. And that's not the direction, it won't drop down. That's the way it goes. So that completes that assembly. Inside the pump housing we have this large O-ring to be replaced with a new one. Get my pick tool, and extract the old O-ring, and boy is that one flattened out. That's really pancaked and fairly rigid. The new one, of course, is nice and round and O-shaped and very pliable. Coat it with new fluid, lube it up, and place it down into the bottom of the housing there. It just lays down in there. There's no groove, it just lays in the bottom and sits against that flange. So now we take the cover assembly and install it onto the main housing. Notice that the rotor splines will mesh with the splines on the main shaft. Get that lined up. I'm going to hold it this way. It's only going to go one direction because this passage has to line up. And rather than turn this upside down and dump all of this off, I'm going to place the housing on top of this assembly. Reinstall the 4 bolts. These are 12mm bolts, and if you're not comfortable with just tightening down to by feel, the specification says 14 foot-pounds or 168 inch-pounds. I'll do that with a torque wrench. installing the flow control valve. Make sure it goes in the right way. Because this way it's got two flats on the top right here. It's rounder on the bottom, so the flats go in first. Give it a little bit of power steering fluid to lubricate it. Place it into the bore. Followed by the spring. And then the cap. I've already replaced the O-ring on the cap. The old O-ring really didn't feel too bad in this case. It was still pliable, but I put a new lubricated O-ring on it. There's a little bit of pressure on this since it's spring-loaded. And it gets torqued down using the 10mm hex to 36 foot-pounds. The last thing to do on the pump itself is to replace the O-ring that is inside of the inlet joint. In fact, this is a common cause for noisy pumps on Hondas, whereas this O-ring will go bad. It won't leak per se, but it will allow air into the system, and as the pump is drawing a vacuum or pulling fluid in through the inlet joint, it'll pull in air, and that'll allow air to go through the pump, and that'll make for a noisy pump. I think there's a TSB on that, but in any case, we will remove this 10mm bolt. And there's your O-ring, the one that often goes bad. It does look a little flat. It just slides off. And my new one's blue. Slide that down on the flange and reinstall the inlet joint. And that's 8 foot-pounds, or very little. Just snug it up. I'm going to wait to install the pulley for the belt and do the reverse of the trick we did before with the extension bar wedged against the housing. So let's put the pump back on the car. So as the pump goes back in, there are 2 holes for fasteners. There's the lower one and one toward the back. The one toward the back has a bolt that goes in right there, and this one goes down here on the tensioner, that bolt that's sticking out right there. First I'll try to get the nut started on the lower tensioner position, and the upper bolt. Those are just finger tight for now. Now for the pulley. Back on the shaft, all the way to engage the splines. The nut, right hand thread nut. And this time I'm going to use my my extension bar underneath this portion of the housing, and I can kind of wedge it up under there, nice and solid, like that. And this is, I believe, 47 foot-pounds with a 19mm socket. Very good. Who needs this paper? A special tool. Now we want to reinstall the outlet hose, the high pressure side of the system, and it has one last O-ring on it. I'll remove that O-ring with my pick tool. Again, being very careful not to scratch the surface. That was so brittle it broke. Hard and flattened out. I'll lubricate my new O-ring with some fresh, clean power steering fluid. And install the flange. So these are only 8 foot-pounds, so just snug them up. That O-ring is what seals it. Now I'm going to put the belt back on and look down and make sure that the belt is around the crankshaft pulley properly. And then fit the grooves into the pump pulley. Slip it on just like that. Now we can tighten up the bolts that hold the... Alright, so those are just finger tight until we get the belt tension right. I'll now go to the tensioning bolt, tensioning nut, and increase the tension on the belt. You're just looking for about a ½ inch of deflection when you push on it. You don't have to push too hard to get that kind of deflection. And you don't want to over tighten it, otherwise you're going to burden the bearing, the main bearing. So with that tensioned properly, I'll just snug up these main fasteners. Not too tight. Alright, I'm going to slide the reservoir back down onto its bracket. It slides up onto these flanges here. It just snaps right there. The upper hose. And the lower hose. We're on the home stretch. Back goes on the engine cover. 10mm bolts. Now I already did a flush on this system, so it's completely empty. Now all we got to do is refill the reservoir. This, by the way, is genuine Honda power steering fluid. I wouldn't use anything else in a Honda. With my flashlight down right behind the reservoir, you can see that I filled it up with one bottle up to the full line. There's two lines, there's the lower line and the upper line. But I haven't started the engine, and when I do so, it's going to draw fluid down into the steering rack and into the pump, and that's probably going to empty all the way, and I'll have to come back and top it off. Yep, so as expected, when I started the engine briefly, it sucked all that fluid out of the reservoir, so I'm going to just top it off with more fluid up to the upper level line. And I'll start the engine again and see what happens. Alright, the fluid did drop some more. Now I want to bleed the air out of the system. You do so by starting the engine and then turning the steering wheel lock to lock several times and bleeding the air out. Sometimes the pump will make some gurgling noises, little grinding noises. It's normal. That's the air going through the pump. I've got the car up in the air on jacks just so that I'm not scrubbing the tires too bad. Makes for the turning of the wheels easier. You can hear the pump making some little noises there. Let's check the fluid level. Let's see what happened here. Ah! So it dropped down further. And that probably explains why it was making a bit of noise. Let me top that fluid up again. So I think that wraps it up for this power steering pump overhaul on this 2002 Honda Odyssey. I understand they use the same power steering pump on other models, including Accords with V6s and other model years. I'm going to keep an eye on the leak and make sure I've taken care of it, and I'll keep an eye on the fluid level too over the next few days and top that off as necessary. Otherwise, I think I'm proud of this. It wasn't too hard, and it's certainly better than paying somebody else to replace the pump or even paying for a remanufactured pump. $20 and a little bit of time and some power steering fluid since I did a flush. That's all it took. Thanks, and if you decide to tackle this project yourself, let me know how it goes. Leave me some comments and questions. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.